Hey everyone, I want to talk today about hearing God's voice. And this is something that I have been interested in for many, many years, since I was exposed to the teachings probably in like 2012 or so. And it's something I feel like I have gone in circles around, and kind of have varied in my viewpoints at different points in my life about these teachings. So I kind of want to dive into my experience there. I want to start by saying that I do not believe that this is a essential teaching of Christianity, meaning I believe that first and foremost, reliance and trust in Christ and what he accomplished at the cross is the most important thing when it comes to what we believe as Christians. And there are debatable topics, and I think that this is one of them. The reason that I want to talk about this is because I think it has a really big impact on our mental health. It affects the way that we relate to ourselves, to God, and to others. And I think if this is something that you're looking to understand and wrestle with, that it's definitely worth exploring. So I want to start off by kind of giving you my background in this area. So I was raised in a Reformed church that, to my recollection, did not talk about hearing God's voice. We did talk about walking in the will of God and having a purpose for your life, that kind of thing. But I was not exposed to teachings about hearing God's voice until I switched churches, and I also started working for a boss that really loves Graham Cook teachings. And if you're not familiar with Graham Cook, you can find him on the internet. And so anyways, I dove headfirst into these teachings because I was so fascinated, and I was really confused about why I had never heard about this concept of hearing God's voice growing up. And so to me, it was really exciting, and I felt like my emotions were engaged at a different level when I was learning about this topic. And I want to talk about the kind of varying viewpoints that I've heard discussed on this topic. A lot of it centers around the Bible verse when Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice and they will not obey the voice of another." And a lot of the teachings, I think, around this topic have to do with the interpretation of that verse. Now, some people believe it very literally, and they believe that we can hear God's voice audibly in our lives if we receive Christ and if we believe in Christ. And other people believe that that verse is alluding only to salvation, and that it's speaking specifically to salvation. The other interpretation that I've heard is that that verse is explaining how believers will be able to recognize the nature of God and will be able to recognize things in their life, and be able to discern whether they are from God or they are not from God. So those are kind of the wide spectrum. I know there's probably other nuanced views in there. And if you have heard a different view, post it down below, and I'd be interested to hear that. But having been in a Reformed church, and then I kind of dove into these teachings, I found myself, I kind of always had this idea of having open communication with God and about prayer and having a strong prayer life. That was and is a way for me to emotionally connect with God. But I had been raised believing that we can talk to God, but I hadn't really been taught about hearing from God. And so I dove headfirst into these teachings. I ended up going to more charismatic leaning churches, even Pentecostal, and also got involved with an organization that has specific teachings about hearing God's voice, and actually has, how do you say this? Kind of like a volunteer effort to encourage other believers in the area of hearing God's voice for themselves, and equipping other people to do that and to be able to encourage one another, which I think in and of itself is a fantastic thing. I think it's really important that we encourage one another, and I think that that is a biblical concept, and I believe that God does want us to be encouraged. I have heard of this idea of hearing God's voice kind of in a range of thoughts, right? So I've heard God told me to do this in like verbatim, like the person believes that God spoke to them either near audibly or audibly, and that is what they are meant to do. And there's a sense that the closer you can be to hearing God audibly, the closer you are in your relationship with God. And I've also heard it said as, I think God is showing me this. Another way that I've heard it is, based on my understanding of God's love, I think this is what God would do in this specific situation to make that love manifest in my reality. And then the last one is the opposite extreme that I have not heard, supported by these ideas of hearing God's voice. And that is, I want to do this in my life and I don't care how it affects anyone else. So that's kind of the opposite extreme. And I, have heard this range. I tend to, I think that believing that second and third idea, that I think God is showing me this, or based on my understanding of God's love, I think this is what God would do in this specific situation to make that love manifest. The second one, I think God is showing me this, is okay. I think that one can somewhat be okay. I think it's better. What's helped me is thinking of it in a more broad sense of, this is my understanding of God's love as I've seen it presented in the scriptures and in the person of Christ, and this is how I'm going to act, believing that this is the best way I can love in this situation. And I think that it's important to recognize the nuance in those thoughts. So if you're questioning whether you're hearing God's voice, that would be one of the first things that I would ask myself is, am I believing that I am audibly hearing the voice of God? Do I think that God is showing me this? Am I aligned with Scripture and I'm developing based on what I've seen, what I understand about this situation, to make a decision? Or am I just going rogue and I don't really care how this affects other people? This is what I want to do. So I think that's important to recognize. Something that I found also to be helpful is understanding my own personality. I'm an INFJ, and INFJs have a reputation of going along with cult thinking at times, and I can understand why. I think this idea of hearing God's voice is pretty popular in more charismatic leaning churches, and that it does have a way of arousing our emotions. I mean, when I believed that I was hearing directly from God, of course that's more engaging than just, this is what I think about God. It's taking it to another level in a way. And I do think that it's okay to interact directly with God, whether that's in worship or prayer. I think it's just very important that we recognize our own thinking patterns in the process. And the reason that I say that is I tend to be very good at finding patterns in general in life. It's something that I'm pretty good at. And one of the things that I was taught in these churches, in these organizations that subscribe to this idea of hearing God's voice, is that one of the ways that you can get confirmation of hearing God's voice is by asking God for confirmation and then essentially waiting and looking for it. And so, I would be asking God, okay, God, like if this is what you want me to do, then can you like show that to me? And sometimes I felt like God was interacting with me in a very powerful way. And I know that's a really touchy subject. It can be a very emotional one. And I think at that point, what I eventually learned is that it's really important for me to separate thoughts that I think are God telling me what to do versus being encouraged by God's love and understanding what I perceive to be God's love in that moment. And so I'm trying to make this more tangible for you guys. I'm just gonna dive into to a extreme story of how this played out in my life. And I, at one point, believed that I was going to marry a very specific person because I believed that God was telling me that I was going to marry this person. And I didn't think that it was in my place to say to this person, hey, I think God's telling me to marry you. I just felt that it was my responsibility to be present and available for that person and to I totally lost my train of thought. Okay, well, hopefully that'll come back. But yes, I know this is a very extreme example, and I'm sharing this not to be scandalous or anything like that, but I've heard other people going through this experience, and I felt a lot of shame after the fact. It turned out that this person was having a lot of other things going on in their life and definitely was not the person that I thought that they were. I had put them on a pedestal, and which you shouldn't do with anybody unless it's God. But that was several years of my life where I was believing for God for this, to the point where I moved across the country to be present in case this person changed their mind. And that, I think, can cause a lot of unneeded stress in a person's life. I think it certainly did for me in certain ways, because I knew that was not normally the way that I would act in that situation. But I was going along with the thought of God is stretching me, God's wanting me to venture out in faith and to trust him that this will happen. I can tell you now that I'm happily married to someone that was not that person. And I'm grateful for the growth that happened coming out of that, but it was a very big emotional fallout for me, and trying to wrap my brain around what had happened and where I had gone wrong took a lot of work. And like I said, I think that understanding my personality, learning Myers-Briggs, learning mental health tools were absolutely critical for me to develop self-trust and to be able to trust myself, because part of the reason that I was so attached to this thought of knowing God's will was because I wanted to please God. And I think that's, that's a good thing if you're a Christian. You want to please God, but I didn't really have the capacity to understand the nuances of what that really meant. I think I had more black and white thinking back then, and I definitely did have black and white thinking back then. And so, I wanted to be certain that I was doing what God wanted me to do on this earth. And that's kind of what kept me going. And I think that one of the dangers also is that, when other people approached me to say that they thought that it wasn't a good idea, which I'm very grateful that they did. I wouldn't have had it any other way. I had a supporter pretty much, and non-supporters, or people who were neutral. And I guess you kind of get that with anything. But I think what happened in my case was that I believed so much that this was God's will that even though people were coming to me with advice and with wisdom, and they were practicing discernment, I wasn't in a place to receive or accept what they were saying, because in my mind, it was like I was doing God's will. And, based on the stories in the Bible, you're going to be persecuted when you're trying to do God's will. Like, that's just the way it is. And so I kind of had this false sense of martyrdom about it, And so while I think that looking back, I can appreciate the endurance that I had during that time, because this was over 3 years. And I don't think, in a good way, I don't think I'd have that kind of patience now, but I don't think it was, a healthy route to go. And so I think the benefits of this line, the whole being able to hear God's voice, or maybe more broadly, the teachings that I heard in churches that subscribe to this idea, were that the messages were based more so on the life and death of Christ. And it wasn't so much focused on the apostles, that was still included and definitely used for encouragement, but the focus was on Christ. And I really love that. I love that it was focused on the heart of God, because growing up, and maybe this was just the way that I took it, it might not have been, intentionally communicated this way, but I felt like a lot of the sermons that I went to spoke to, okay, if you're a Christian, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. And so it was a big list of what we had permission to do and what we didn't have permission to do. And so there wasn't much of a relationship there, for me with God. And I think that is something that I gained from being a part of these Christian communities, is understanding the nature and the heart of God, and that being paramount. And there's a verse in the Bible that says, as we behold him, we become more like him. And I really I experienced that, because it's really hard, I think, to grow just by do's and don'ts. For me, I need the bigger picture, and the do's and don'ts also don't account for nuance and very specific situations necessarily. And I found that a lot of the teachings that I was encountering were hard to practice in my own life, they were hard to practice because they didn't necessarily specifically meet my specific situation, or I made the error of assuming that they did fit my situation, and I misapplied teachings, which I think is largely what I leaned into was I didn't understand these general teachings were just that general, and that in specific situations, the way that you take action or not take action is going to be different. So I think another benefit that I gained from these Christian organizations that taught around this is flexibility. And it's almost kind of ironic because my thinking was so black and white that I thought, like I have to hear God's voice about this before I take action in a certain area. But it also helped me to be flexible. How do I explain this? It taught me, I guess, to be more present in the moment. I would pray more to God. I would talk with God more because I wanted to hear like what God was thinking about a specific situation. And again, I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think for me, the biggie is that there needs to be a separation between I'm directly hearing God's voice and the thought of like, this is what I believe about God, and this in my imagination is the best way to act in this situation in a loving way. So I think that it's important to have that second thing in mind and to not necessarily believe that it's directly from God. And something else I want to touch on that I encountered that I think we don't talk about in churches, but it's really important, especially when it comes to teachings like this, is that some people view the idea of the spirit, soul, and body differently. And that affects teaching. So there's some people who believe that spirit, soul, and body are 3 different parts of us. And that the spirit part of us is infallible and untouchable. And so if you're believing that God is speaking to you through your spirit and that is infallible, then that can be really dangerous, I think. And then there are others who believe that spirit and soul are basically the same thing, that humans are fallible, but as we encounter the love of God, as we learn about the love of God, and we see Christ in the scriptures and how he loved, that becomes a part of us. And I lean towards that now, that belief. I think we are fallible. I think that, this side of heaven, there's just stuff that we don't know. I mean, we wouldn't be talking about this topic if we could all directly talk and hear from God. Like, that would be amazing. And I think that, I don't know, like, I think it will be like that in heaven. And it's hard to imagine what it'll be like because we've never experienced that. But I think it's going to be absolutely amazing. Anyways, so I want to go over the dangers that I experienced myself with teachings about hearing God's voice. And I think that for me, what I have learned is that I tend to have a lot of self-doubt. And so if I'm going to err on the side of anything, it's going to be on the side of believing God rather than myself. And I think that, like I said, I think I've had a lot of black and white thinking in the past, and I thought of trusting myself and then trusting others being as completely separate from trusting God. And I don't think it's that black and white now. Especially if we are believers, and are acknowledging God. And yeah, so I think that also this gets into the topic of God's control and sovereignty. And we're just hitting all the heavy hitters today. But I mention this because I was taught growing up that God is in control. And so you don't need to worry, God is in control. And so that was kind of used as a way to dismiss feelings of fear or anger or any perceived negative emotions. And so I think that the danger in that for me was that I was very prone to denying my own feelings, not recognizing my own feelings, and invalidating my own feelings. And that's not good. I think God gives us emotions for a reason. And I think that the ideas, the questions that I had to wrestle with in stepping into what I am in now, in my understanding about hearing God's voice, is I did a lot of research on this topic, especially several years ago. I also read some books by mental health therapists on gaslighting, and I went through a lot of mental health resources around improving self-trust and setting boundaries. And that has been incredibly helpful for me. And I think that's why I'm able to speak about this now, because I think I didn't really have the language for it before. I didn't really understand what had happened. But in the process of encountering those, again, I think that it's really important that if I'm having a thought where I feel like God's telling me this, for me, I have found it's really important to identify whether I'm having my emotional needs met. Why am I so attached to this idea of it being God's voice? If it's something I really want, why can't I just say that? This is something I really want. And that was something in the past that I couldn't do. I couldn't say what I wanted because, one, I didn't know what I wanted, because I thought it was not okay to want things, really. For myself, I thought it had to be all God, and I didn't recognize that, God calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves, and to be able to love ourselves, we need to be able to identify our needs and wants and desires. And that's not to say that we get everything we want in life, but it's really important, I think, to be able to understand our relationship with God and with ourselves and with other people. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to place some questions in the description for you to kind of mull over. I have over 20, and that's a lot. And I think, that would be a lot to go over here, and you can just explore them on your own. Let me know if it's helpful for you. These are just questions that I've explored myself. I don't have the answers. You might have a completely different set of thoughts about this. And I would be really interested to hear. If you have encountered teachings about hearing God's voice, what have your thoughts been about it? And have you experienced any fallout or even good things from those teachings? I'd be really interested to know. And if you're interested in hearing more discussions like this, you can check out my faith playlist. I will put that in the end cards. And also, you might be wondering, I meant to point this out earlier, but I'm wearing a heart monitor. That might be a little distracting for some people, but if you want to hear more about my medical journey, which has actually helped me to develop these skills that I'm now talking to you about in an interesting way, about, developing wisdom, developing discernment, and about how those are also God-given. And it might be difficult and hard work to do, but it's really worth it in my perspective. But I will also put a link to either one of those videos or the playlist as well. So like I said, I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts around this topic. If it was thought-provoking to you, if it was helpful, if you disagreed or agreed with any of it, I would love to know. So feel free to leave your comments below. Please be sure to keep it respectful. I know I've never had any issues with this, but I know it can be a really touchy subject for a lot of people. So just bear in mind that this is not a This is not a matter of whether you're a Christian or not. It's a non-essential debatable topic that even theologians debate over. So just know that and give everybody a lot of grace. And I look forward to chatting with y'all.